am Sophia. I never imagined my life would take such a cruel turn. The man I once loved, the father of my children, vanished into thin air when I needed him the most. But fate has a way of making people face their past, no matter how far they run. I wasn't expecting to see him ever again, let alone in the most unexpected place. My heart pounded as I stood frozen, staring at the man who had abandoned me all those years ago. His face, once familiar and adored, now carried traces of regret and disbelief. His eyes flickered from me to the 3 boys standing beside me. His sons, our sons, the very children he left behind without a word. And in that moment, the past came crashing down on both of us. It was supposed to be a normal evening, a small celebration with my boys. We had come to this restaurant many times, enjoying laughter, stories, and a meal together. But that day, something felt different. A strange weight hung in the air, a feeling I couldn't quite explain. As I placed our order, I sensed someone watching us. I turned my head slowly, and there he was, Daniel, the man who disappeared the night our babies were born. He sat alone, his fingers frozen over his plate, his expression unreadable. But his eyes told me everything. He recognized them. How could he not? The triplets were the perfect reflection of him. For a moment, time stood still. My hands clenched the edge of the table as emotions I had buried for years threatened to resurface. Anger, pain, betrayal. Memories flashed before my eyes. The hospital room, the empty crib beside me, the heart-shattering moment when I realized he was never coming back. And now, here he was, after all these years, sitting just a few feet away. My mind raced with questions. Did he know we lived in the same city? Had he been looking for us? Or was this a cruel coincidence? Whatever the reason, fate had thrown him back into our lives when I least expected it. Then, before I could stop them, my boys spoke. "Mom, why does that man keep staring at us?" Liam, the eldest by just a few minutes, asked innocently. His voice, filled with curiosity, shattered the silence between us. I swallowed hard, trying to find the right words. My heart ached because they didn't know. They had never asked about their father before. I had never told them the truth. How could I? How do you tell 3 beautiful children that their father walked away without a second thought? But now, with Daniel sitting there, his presence forcing the past into the present, I realized that I could no longer avoid it. I took a deep breath, steadying myself. This was the moment I had feared for years, the moment I would have to face him again. But this time, I wasn't the broken woman he left behind. I was stronger, and I wasn't going to let him walk away without an explanation. Looking back, it's hard to believe how deeply in love we once were. Daniel wasn't just my husband. He was my best friend, my safe place, the man I thought I would grow old with. When we met, everything felt like a fairy tale. I was young, full of dreams, and he was the charming, ambitious man who swept me off my feet. We spent hours talking about the future, our dream house, our careers, the family we would build together. I had no idea then that the same man who promised forever would one day leave me standing alone, carrying the weight of his broken promises. Daniel had always been full of life, the kind of man who could walk into a room and make everyone laugh. He had big dreams, always talking about how he would make something of himself, how he wanted to give me the world. I believed every word. When he asked me to marry him, I didn't hesitate. Our wedding was simple, but it was everything I had ever wanted. Just the 2 of us, surrounded by close family and friends, exchanging vows that were supposed to last a lifetime. I remember the way he looked at me that day, his eyes filled with love and devotion. If only I had known then that love, no matter how deep, sometimes isn't enough to keep someone from running away. The first year of our marriage was perfect. We were happy, young, and in love. Every night we would stay up late talking about our future children, the names we liked, the kind of parents we wanted to be. We laughed about how our kids would take after him, stubborn, adventurous, and full of life. When I found out I was pregnant, I was terrified, but excited. I held the test in my hands, my heart pounding, wondering how Daniel would react. But when I told him, his face lit up like a child on Christmas morning. He lifted me off my feet, spinning me around, promising that he would take care of me, that we would be the best parents in the world. In that moment, I believed him. Pregnancy brought us even closer. Daniel would talk to my belly every night, telling our unborn baby stories, making promises about all the adventures we would have as a family. We decorated the nursery together, arguing playfully over colors and baby names. He was there for every doctor's appointment, holding my hand, making jokes to calm my nerves. I had no doubt that he would be an amazing father, but things started to change the day we found out we weren't having just one baby. We were having 3. I remember the ultrasound room, the way Daniel's laughter turned into stunned silence when the doctor pointed at the screen. 3 heartbeats, she said with a smile. I was in shock, but my heart was bursting with joy. We were going to have triplets. But Daniel, something in his expression shifted. He squeezed my hand, forcing a smile, but I could see the panic in his eyes. That was the first moment I felt something wasn't right. The first moment I saw fear in him instead of excitement. I brushed it off, thinking he just needed time to process the news. After all, 3 babies were a lot to take in. But deep down, a small part of me knew something between us had changed. As my belly grew, so did the distance between us. Daniel stopped talking about the future with the same excitement. He worked longer hours, came home exhausted, and spent less time with
me. At first, I thought he was just trying to provide for our growing family, but a part of me wondered if he was pulling away.
I told myself it was just stress, that once the babies arrived, everything would go back to normal. I believed in him, in us. I never imagined that the man who held my hand through every doctor's visit would disappear the moment our babies entered the world. The day we found out we were having triplets should have been the happiest moment of our lives. I remember lying on the examination table, watching the screen as the doctor pointed at 3 tiny, flickering heartbeats. "Congratulations, you're having triplets," she said cheerfully. My heart swelled with excitement, and I turned to Daniel, expecting to see the same joy reflected in his eyes. Instead, I saw something else, something that sent a chill down my spine. His smile was forced, his grip on my hand had loosened, and for a brief moment, he looked like a man trapped in a nightmare. On the way home, I couldn't stop smiling, imagining our life with 3 beautiful babies. "Can you believe it, Daniel?" I asked, my voice full of wonder. 3 little versions of us. He chuckled, but it sounded hollow. "Yeah, it's a lot to take in." His words were simple, but his tone carried a weight I didn't understand. I told myself he was just overwhelmed. It was a big change after all. But deep down, a small voice whispered, something wasn't right. As my pregnancy progressed, Daniel changed in ways I never expected. At first it was subtle. Missed calls during the day, coming home late from work, long silences when we used to talk for hours. I tried to be understanding. He was under a lot of pressure. Providing for 1 child was hard enough, but 3? I convinced myself that he was just processing everything in his own way. But as the months went by, his distance became undeniable. One night, I woke up to find him sitting on the edge of the bed, his head in his hands. "What's wrong?" I asked, reaching out to him. He sighed deeply, running his fingers through his hair. I don't know if I'm ready for this, Sophia." His words sent a sharp pain through my chest. I forced a smile, hiding my own fears. "No one is ever truly ready, Daniel, but we'll figure it out together." He nodded, but his eyes told me that he wasn't convinced. The cracks in our marriage became more visible as my belly grew. He stopped coming to doctor's appointments, making excuses about work. The nursery we had once planned together remained unfinished, untouched, as if he didn't want to accept what was coming. I would find him sitting alone at night, staring at nothing, lost in thoughts he never shared. When I asked him about it, he would just shake his head and say, "I'm fine," but I knew he wasn't fine. Then came the fights. Small disagreements that turned into arguments that left me crying alone in bed. "You don't understand the pressure I'm under," he snapped one evening when I asked why he was so distant. 3 babies, Sophia. This isn't what I planned." His words stung. "You think this is easy for me?" I shot back, my voice shaking. "I'm the one carrying them, Daniel. But I love them, and I need you to love them too." He didn't respond. He just grabbed his keys and walked out. That was the first time I realized that maybe, just maybe, he was planning to leave. Despite everything, I held on to hope. I told myself that once the babies were born, Daniel would change, that seeing their tiny faces would make him realize what we had, what he was about to lose. I wanted to believe that the man I fell in love with was still in there somewhere, but deep down, I was scared, because for the first time since we got married, I wasn't sure if love was enough to keep him with me. Then, the day arrived. My contractions started early in the morning, sharp and relentless. I called Daniel, my hands shaking as I clutched my belly. He didn't pick up. Panic set in as I dialed again and again. Finally, he answered, his voice groggy. "What is it?" he mumbled. "Daniel, it's time." I gasped through the pain. Silence. "Daniel?" I whispered. "Yeah, I'll be there," he said flatly. And then the line went dead. The ride to the hospital was a blur of pain and fear. I kept looking at the door, expecting Daniel to walk in at any moment. But he didn't. Hours passed. The doctors and nurses moved around me, their voices blending into the background. And then, finally, after what felt like an eternity, I heard their cries. 3 beautiful, healthy baby boys. The nurses placed them in my arms, and tears filled my eyes. "You're safe now," I whispered to them. "Mommy's here." But Daniel wasn't. I asked a nurse if she had seen him. She shook her head. "Maybe he's running late," she offered kindly. But I knew better. Something inside me shattered. As I stared at the empty doorway, I reached for my phone, my heart pounding. A single message flashed on the screen. "I can't do this. I'm sorry." And just like that, Daniel was gone. I read the message over and over again, hoping that somehow I had misunderstood. My hands trembled as I held the phone, my mind refusing to accept the reality staring back at me. "I can't do this. I'm sorry." That was it. No explanation, no goodbye. Just 7 words that shattered everything I had ever believed about love, trust, and family. The room around me felt suddenly cold, despite the warmth of my newborn babies nestled against my chest. My breath came in short, uneven gasps as the weight of Daniel's absence pressed down on me like a crushing force. He was supposed to be here. He was supposed to hold my hand, to whisper words of comfort, to meet his sons for the first time. But instead, he had left, just like that. A nurse walked in, smiling softly. "How are you feeling, sweetheart?" she asked, her voice kind. I opened my mouth to speak, but nothing came out. My throat tightened, and my vision blurred with unshed tears. She must have seen the panic in my eyes because her expression changed. "Do you need me to call someone? Your husband?" The word felt like a knife twisting in my chest. My husband. The man who had promised to stand by me in sickness and in health, through good times and bad. I forced myself to swallow the lump in my throat and shook my head. "No," I whispered. "There's no one to call." I spent the next few hours in a daze, going through the motions as nurses checked on me and the babies. I answered their questions, nodded when they gave me instructions. But inside, I was numb. My heart was breaking, but I couldn't fall apart. I had 3 tiny souls depending on me now. I had no choice but to be strong. As the hours turned into days, I held on to the hope that Daniel would come back. Maybe he was scared. Maybe he just needed time to process everything. I convinced myself that he would walk through that hospital door any moment now, full of regret, ready to make things right. But as each day passed, that hope faded. On the 3rd day, a nurse handed me a folder. "It's for you," she said gently. I hesitated before opening it, my hands shaking. Inside was a set of discharge papers and a legal document. My heart pounded as I read the words at the top. Waiver of parental rights. Tears welled in my eyes as I scanned the paper, my breath catching in my throat. Daniel had signed away his rights. He had made it official. He didn't just walk away. He wanted nothing to do with us. The realization hit me like a tidal wave, knocking the air from my lungs. This wasn't a moment of fear or temporary doubt. This was abandonment. A sob broke free from my chest as I clutched the paper, my whole body trembling. The nurse placed a gentle hand on my shoulder. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. I couldn't speak. I could barely breathe. How could he do this? How could he look at the children we created and decide he didn't want them? How could he throw us away so easily? I held my babies close that night, watching their tiny chests rise and fall as they slept peacefully in the hospital crib beside me. They had no idea that their father had already given up on them. No idea that the man who should have been their protector had walked away without a second thought. I promised myself then and there that I would never let them feel his absence. I would give them enough love for 2 parents. I would be strong for them, even if I felt like breaking inside. When the day came for us to leave the hospital, reality set in even harder. I had no one to help me carry the car seats, no one to share in the overwhelming moment of bringing our children home for the first time. I had to do it all alone. The nurses helped me strap the babies in, offering sympathetic smiles, but I could see the pity in their eyes. I fought back the tears as I drove home, glancing in the rearview mirror at the 3 tiny faces bundled up in the back seat. They were so perfect, so innocent. They deserved a father who would love them, cherish them. But all they had was me, and I wasn't going to let them down. When we arrived home, the silence of the house felt deafening. The nursery Daniel and I had once dreamed about still sat, half finished. The crib he was supposed to build remained in pieces in the corner. I stood in the doorway, holding my babies, and felt the weight of reality settle on my shoulders. He was really gone. This wasn't just a nightmare I would wake up from. This was my life now. I took a deep breath and stepped inside. I placed my sons gently in their bassinets and sat on the floor beside them, wrapping my arms around my knees. I allowed myself one last moment of grief, one last moment to cry for the life I had lost, for the man who had betrayed me, for the future I had imagined but would never have. Then I wiped my tears away and looked at my babies. "It's just us now," I whispered. "But we're going to be okay, I promise." And from that moment on, I stopped waiting for Daniel to come back, because I knew he never would. The first night home with the triplets was the longest night of my life. I sat in the dimly lit nursery, rocking one baby while the other 2 cried in their bassinets. Exhaustion clung to my body, my eyes burning from lack of sleep, but I couldn't stop. There was no one to take turns with, no one to whisper, "Go rest, I got this." It was just me. I had never felt so alone, yet at the same time I had never felt so determined. These 3 little souls depended on me, and no matter how hard it got, I wouldn't fail them. The days blurred together into an endless cycle of feeding, changing diapers, and rocking babies to sleep. I barely had time to eat, let alone process the pain of what had happened. My heart still ached for Daniel's betrayal, but there was no time to dwell on it. Survival became my only focus. Bills started piling up, and the reality of raising 3 babies alone hit me like a truck. The maternity leave I had wasn't enough, and my savings were running out fast. I had to make a choice: stay home with my boys and risk losing everything, or go back to work and leave them in someone else's care. The thought of being away from them tore me apart, but I had no other option. I found a daycare that was willing to take all 3, but the cost was more than half my paycheck. I fought back tears as I handed over the money, knowing that every dollar spent on childcare meant less food on the table, fewer essentials, more sacrifices. Returning to work was harder than I imagined. The exhaustion was unbearable. I would come home every evening, my body aching, and immediately dive into my second job, being a mother. I barely slept, surviving on coffee and sheer willpower. The house was always a mess, and laundry piled up faster than I could manage. Some nights, I would collapse on the couch, tears slipping down my cheeks, wondering if I was strong enough to do this. The loneliness was the worst part. I had no one to share the little moments with, the first smiles, the tiny giggles, the way Liam always reached for my hand, how Noah's eyes followed me everywhere, or how Ethan's tiny fingers curled around mine when he slept. These were the moments Daniel should have been here for. These were the moments he had chosen to miss. People would tell me, "You're so strong," but they didn't see the nights I cried in the shower, muffling my sobs so my babies wouldn't hear. They didn't see the times I stood in the grocery store, doing mental math to make sure I could afford formula and diapers in the same trip. They didn't see the mornings when I stared at myself in the mirror, unrecognizable, wondering what happened to the woman I used to be. But no matter how hard it got, I never let my boys see me break. To them, I was their everything, their provider, their protector, their source of comfort. And in return, they were my strength. The love I had for them overshadowed the pain of Daniel's absence. Every time they smiled at me, every time they clung to me for comfort, I knew I was exactly where I needed to be. Then came the milestones. First words, first steps, first birthday. I threw them a small party, just the 4 of us, with a homemade cake and dollar store decorations. As they smashed their tiny hands into the cake, giggling in delight, I felt an overwhelming sense of pride. We had made it through the first year. I had done it, alone. But the challenges didn't stop there. As the boys grew, so did the expenses. Every month felt like a battle to stretch my paycheck just a little further. I started picking up extra shifts, leaving before sunrise and coming home long after they were asleep. It broke my heart, but I reminded myself that I was doing it for them. As the years passed, I learned to adapt. I became a master of multitasking, balancing work, parenting, and everything in between. I stopped expecting help, stopped waiting for an apology that would never come. Instead, I focused on building a life for my sons. They were my world, and nothing, not exhaustion, not loneliness, not even the memory of Daniel, could take that away. And then one night, Noah asked a question that made my heart stop. "Mommy, do we have a daddy?" I froze, my breath catching in my throat. It was the question I had dreaded for years. The boys were only 5, too young to understand the depth of what had happened. I forced a smile, kneeling beside them. "Everyone has a daddy," I said carefully, "but sometimes daddies have to go away." Liam frowned. "But why?" I swallowed the lump in my throat. How could I explain abandonment to a child? How could I tell them the truth without breaking their little hearts? "Because sometimes grown-ups make choices that we don't understand," I said softly. "But do you know what's important?" I cupped their faces, looking each of them in the eye. "You have me, and I will never leave you." That seemed to satisfy them, at least for now. But I knew the question would come up again someday, and when it did, I would have to find a way to tell them the truth without making them feel unwanted. Despite everything, we kept moving forward. The years passed, and my little boys grew into bright, happy children. They had no idea of the struggles I faced behind closed doors, no idea of the sacrifices I made just to keep food on the table and a roof over our heads, and I wanted to keep it that way. I had built a life without Daniel. I had proved to myself and to the world that I didn't need him. But fate has a strange way of bringing the past back when you least expect it, and I had no idea that our paths were about to cross again. Time passed faster than I ever expected. One moment, I was cradling my newborn sons in my arms, promising to be everything they needed. The next, I was watching them run through the house, backpacks slung over their shoulders, their laughter filling the walls that once felt too empty. My boys were 10 years old now, strong, smart, and full of life. I had raised them on my own, and despite all the struggles, I was proud of the life we had built. I no longer looked back. Daniel was just a ghost of the past, a name I barely allowed myself to think about. That evening, the boys and I decided to celebrate a special moment. Liam had won first place in his school's science fair, and Noah and Ethan had both aced their spelling tests. It was a small victory, but in our little family, every victory was worth celebrating. "Mom, can we go to Charlie's Diner?" Ethan asked excitedly, his eyes lighting up. It was their favorite place, the one spot where we had shared so many happy memories. I smiled and nodded. "Of course, sweetheart. Let's go." We arrived at the diner, and the familiar scent of fresh burgers and fries filled the air. The boys ran ahead, laughing as they raced to our usual booth near the window. I followed, my heart swelling with love as I watched them. They were my entire world, and I had done everything in my power to make sure they never felt the void of a missing father. As we settled into our seats, I glanced around the room, enjoying the warmth of the familiar space, and then my breath caught in my throat. Across the diner, sitting alone at a table near the back, was him, Daniel. For a moment, my body froze, my heart slamming against my chest. My hands clenched the menu as I struggled to process what I was seeing. It had been 10 years since I last saw him, 10 years since he walked away without a second thought, and yet here he was, looking so much like the man I once loved, but different in ways I couldn't quite place. His hair was slightly grayer, his face more tired, but his eyes still carried the same deep brown warmth I remembered. I willed myself to look away, to pretend he wasn't there, but then it happened. He looked up. Our eyes met, and in that single moment, time seemed to stop. Shock flashed across his face, followed by something else, guilt. His gaze flickered from me to the 3 boys sitting beside me, and I saw the exact moment realization hit him like a thunderbolt. He recognized them. How could he not? My boys were his sons. A deep silence filled the space between us, an unspoken storm raging between our locked eyes. My heart pounded, but I forced myself to breathe, to keep my composure. I had spent 10 years healing, 10 years learning to live without him. I would not let him shake me now. Before I could react, Liam, always the most observant of the 3, noticed the way the stranger was looking at us. He turned to me, his brow furrowed in confusion. "Mom, why is that man staring at us?" Panic surged through me, but I kept my voice calm. "It's nothing, sweetheart," I said quickly, reaching for my glass of water, trying to steady my trembling hands. but I could feel Daniel still watching, could feel the weight of his stare pressing against me. And then, he stood up. A part of me wanted to grab my boys and leave before he reached us, but it was too late. He was already walking toward our table, his steps slow, hesitant. My breath hitched as he stopped a few feet away, his eyes filled with something I couldn't quite read. Guilt, regret, pain, maybe all of them. Sophia, his voice was barely above a whisper. Hearing my name from his lips after so many years sent a shiver down my spine. I swallowed hard, keeping my expression unreadable. "Daniel," I said, my voice steady, despite the whirlwind of emotions crashing inside me. The boys looked between us, sensing the tension. Ethan, the most curious, tilted his head. "Mom, do you know him?" Daniel's eyes flickered toward his sons, our sons. He looked as if he wanted to say something, but no words came. I could see the battle happening inside him, the weight of 10 years of absence pressing against his chest. But I wasn't going to make this easy for him. He had made his choice all those years ago. He had left. And now he had to face the consequences. For a long moment, there was nothing but silence, the kind of silence that weighed heavy, pressing against my chest, filling the space between us with all the words that had been left unsaid for the past 10 years. Daniel stood there, frozen, his gaze darting between me and the 3 boys sitting at the table. His face was pale, his hands clenched at his sides as if trying to steady himself. I could see the shock in his eyes, the way realization crashed over him like a tidal wave. I didn't move. I didn't speak. I just watched as the man who had walked away from us struggled to find his voice. "Sophia," he finally breathed, his voice unsteady. Hearing my name from his lips after so many years sent a strange sensation through me, one I couldn't quite place. Anger? Sadness? Maybe both. I straightened my back, forcing my expression to remain unreadable. I had imagined this moment before, but never like this. Never with my children sitting beside me, waiting for an answer to a question they didn't even know they needed to ask. "Mom?" Liam's voice broke through the tension, his young face filled with curiosity. "Who is this man?" I sucked in a slow breath, forcing myself to stay calm. This was not the time or place to fall apart. I looked at my sons, the 3 innocent boys who had no idea that the man standing in front of them was the one who had abandoned them before they even had a chance to know him. How could I explain something so complicated in a single moment? Daniel opened his mouth as if to speak, but no words came. His throat worked as he swallowed hard, his eyes never leaving the boys. He looked lost, as if the weight of what he had done was finally sinking in, and maybe, for the first time, he was truly seeing what he had left behind. I didn't know," he whispered, more to himself than to me. His voice was laced with disbelief, regret dripping from every syllable. "I didn't know they were—" He stopped, shaking his head. "They're mine, aren't they?" A bitter laugh escaped me before I could stop it. The audacity of his words, of his shock, nearly made me lose my composure. "You didn't know?" I repeated, my voice sharp. "Daniel, you knew I was pregnant when you left. You just didn't care enough to stay." He flinched as if I had slapped him. The guilt in his eyes deepened, but I refused to feel sympathy for him. Not after everything. Not after 10 years of silence, 10 years of struggling alone, 10 years of explaining away his absence with gentle lies, because I didn't want my boys to grow up feeling unwanted. Noah, always the quiet observer, narrowed his eyes at Daniel. "Why do you look like us?" he asked bluntly. I saw the way Daniel's breath caught in his throat. He looked at them again, really looked at them this time. Liam, with his same determined eyes. Ethan, with his mischievous grin. Noah, with his thoughtful expression. They were his mirror image, the proof of what he had walked away from. I could see the war inside him, the realization crashing over him in waves. He had missed everything. Their first steps, their first words, their first days of school. He had missed birthday parties, bedtime stories, scraped knees, and tiny arms wrapping around my neck, whispering, "I love you, Mommy." And now, standing before them, he was nothing more than a stranger. Daniel ran a hand over his face, exhaling shakily. "I made a mistake," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I was scared. I was young and selfish, and I don't expect you to forgive me, but I didn't know what I was losing until now." I scoffed, shaking my head. "You don't get to say that now, Daniel. You don't get to stand here and act like you suddenly regret everything when I was the one who had to pick up the pieces." You weren't the one staying up all night with 3 newborns. You weren't the one working double shifts just to keep a roof over our heads. You weren't the one answering their questions about why they didn't have a father. My voice broke slightly, but I refused to let the tears fall. You don't get to walk back into our lives just because you finally feel guilty. He looked shattered. For the first time since I had met him, Daniel had no words. He opened his mouth, then closed it again, his shoulders slumping. He knew I was right. There was no excuse good enough, no apology that could erase the past. Liam, always the bravest, finally spoke up. "Are you our dad?" His voice was steady, but there was a hesitation in his eyes, as if he wasn't sure he wanted the answer. Daniel let out a shaky breath. "Yes," he admitted. "I am." A heavy silence followed. My heart pounded as I looked at my boys, their young faces filled with confusion, curiosity, and something else, something I couldn't quite read. I had spent years protecting them from this moment, from this man, and now fate had thrown him back into our lives in the most unexpected way. I wanted to grab my boys and walk away, to shield them from the pain I knew Daniel was capable of causing. But then I saw it, the way his eyes shimmered with unshed tears, the raw, unfiltered regret carved into his features. He wasn't the same man who had left all those years ago. He looked older, heavier, with the burden of his choices. And for the first time, I wondered if walking away had destroyed him just as much as it had broken me. But did that change anything? Did regret make up for the lost years? I took a deep breath, steadying myself. Whatever happened next, one thing was certain. Daniel had to face the consequences of his choices. He had to earn the right to be in our lives, and I wasn't sure if he ever truly could. I sat across from Daniel in the dimly lit diner, my arms folded tightly over my chest, my heart pounding with a mixture of anger and exhaustion. The boys had finished eating and were now playing with their napkins, completely unaware of the storm brewing between their parents. I had sent them to the counter to pick out desserts, giving me a moment alone with the man who had walked away from us 10 years ago. Daniel shifted uncomfortably, his hands clasped together as he stared at the table instead of looking at me. For a man who had always been so sure of himself, he now looked lost, like a man drowning in the weight of his own choices. But I wasn't here to save him. Not anymore. "I don't even know what to say," he finally admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. I let out a bitter laugh, shaking my head. "That's funny because 10 years ago you didn't even bother saying goodbye." My voice was sharper than I intended, but I didn't care. He needed to feel the pain he had caused. He flinched, his fingers tightening around the edge of the table. "I deserve that." He exhaled slowly before meeting my gaze. "Sophia, I know I can't change the past. I know I was a coward for leaving. But please believe me when I say, I regret it every single day." I studied him, searching for any sign that he was lying. But his face, though aged with time, was raw with honesty. Still, regret wasn't enough. "Why, Daniel?" I demanded. "Why did you leave? Why did you disappear when I needed you the most?" He swallowed hard, his eyes filled with something that almost looked like shame. "I was scared." His voice was hoarse, thick with emotions he had kept buried for a decade. "When we found out about the triplets, something in me snapped. I kept thinking about all the ways I would fail, all the ways I wasn't ready. And instead of staying, instead of being a man, I ran. I told myself it was for the best, that you'd be better off without me." I clenched my jaw, my hands curling into fists. "You don't get to decide what was best for us, Daniel. That wasn't your choice to make." He nodded slowly. "I know, and I hate myself for it." His voice cracked, his fingers gripping the table like he was holding on for dear life. "You have no idea how many times I wanted to come back. How many times I picked up the phone but didn't know what to say. How many nights I lay awake wondering what my sons looked like, how they were growing up without me." He let out a shaky breath. "But every time, I convinced myself that you were better off without me, that I had made my choice, and I had to live with it." I wanted to scream at him, to tell him that his regret meant nothing after all these years. But instead, I just sat there, staring at the man I had once loved, the man who had left me shattered and alone. And for the first time, I realized something. I no longer needed his apology. I had already survived without him. I had already built a life for my boys, a life where he didn't exist. "You don't get to come back and expect forgiveness," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "You don't get to show up after 10 years and hope everything will go back to the way it was. His face fell, and for a moment, I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. "I don't expect anything, Sophia," he said quietly. "But I need to try. I need to be in their lives if they'll let me." I inhaled deeply, my heart aching at the weight of his words. "And what happens when it gets hard, Daniel? What happens when they ask you why you left? Are you going to run again?" His eyes darkened with determination. "No, never again." I studied him, trying to decide if I believed him. But before I could respond, I heard small footsteps approaching. The boys were back, each holding a small cup of ice cream, their eyes darting between me and Daniel. Ethan was the first to speak. "Mom, can we sit with him?" The question hit me like a punch to the gut. I opened my mouth to say no, to tell them to stay close to me, but then I saw it. The hope in Daniel's eyes, the silent plea written all over his face. And then I saw my boys, their innocent faces, their curiosity, their desire to understand who this man was. I sighed, nodding reluctantly. "Fine," but only for a few minutes. Their faces lit up as they hurried over to Daniel's side of the booth. He looked stunned, his hands shaking slightly as they climbed in beside him, and for the first time in 10 years, he was exactly where he should have been, sitting beside the family he left behind. The boys settled into the booth beside Daniel, their small bodies scooting closer, their curious eyes studying him like he was a puzzle they were trying to solve. He looked overwhelmed, his hands resting on the table, his breathing uneven. I could tell he didn't know what to do, how to act. He had imagined this moment for years, but now that it was happening, he was frozen. Liam, always the boldest, was the first to speak. "So, you're our dad?" Daniel's lips parted slightly, his throat working as he swallowed hard. "Yes," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I am." Ethan tilted his head. "Where have you been?" His question was innocent, but the weight behind it was anything but. Daniel hesitated, his hands clenching into fists on the table. I could see the war inside him, the struggle to find the right words. He turned to me, almost as if asking for permission. I said nothing. This was his mess to clean up. He exhaled slowly. "I made a mistake. A really big mistake. I left when I shouldn't have, and I know I hurt you. All of you." His voice cracked. "But I never stopped thinking about you. I never stopped wondering what kind of boys you were growing up to." Noah, the quietest of the three, frowned. "If you thought about us, why didn't you come back?" Daniel blinked, his eyes glistening. "Because I was scared," he admitted. "Scared that you wouldn't want me, that I had done too much damage." His gaze flickered toward me, that it was too late. The boys exchanged glances, their expressions unreadable. My heart ached for them. They had never questioned their father's absence before, never asked about him. I had done everything in my power to make sure they never felt like they were missing anything. But now they were being forced to face a truth I had shielded them from for a decade. Liam took a deep breath and sat up straighter. "So, what do you want now?" Daniel's fingers tightened around the edge of the table. "I want to know you, if you'll let me." His voice was barely above a whisper. "I know I don't deserve it, but I want to try. I want to be part of your lives." Silence stretched between them. My heart pounded in my chest, waiting for what they would say. This was their choice. I wouldn't make it for them. Ethan took a spoonful of his ice cream, chewing thoughtfully before shrugging. "I guess we could try." Liam nodded slowly. "Yeah, but you don't get to just leave again." Daniel's eyes widened, his voice firm. "I won't, I swear." Noah remained quiet for a long time, before finally meeting Daniel's gaze. "Okay," he said softly, "but you have to prove it." Daniel nodded, his face filled with relief and something else. Hope. For the first time in 10 years, he had been given a second chance. Daniel kept his promise. At first I was skeptical, watching his every move, waiting for him to slip back into the man who had walked away so easily. But he didn't. He showed up, again and again. He met the boys for ice cream after school, sat through their soccer games, and even attended Noah's chess tournament, cheering loudly from the audience. It was strange seeing him there. For years, I had been the only one in the crowd, the only one clapping, the only one wiping away their tears after a loss. And now, suddenly, he was beside me, acting as though he had always belonged. But I couldn't forget. I couldn't ignore the past just because he was here now. One afternoon, Liam fell while riding his bike, scraping his knee badly. I was about to run to him when Daniel got there first. He crouched beside him, his hands shaking slightly as he gently examined the wound. "It's okay, buddy," he said, his voice steady. "You're tough. We'll clean it up, and you'll be good as new." Liam sniffled but nodded, allowing Daniel to pick him up. I watched in silence, something stirring inside me that I didn't want to acknowledge. Later that night, when the boys were asleep, Daniel hesitated in the doorway. "Thank you for letting me do this," he murmured. I turned to him, arms crossed. "I didn't do this for you. I did it for them." He nodded, his eyes filled with something unreadable. I know. As the days turned into weeks, I couldn't deny that the boys were happier. They had started asking about him when he wasn't around, looking forward to their time together. They had forgiven him in ways I wasn't sure I ever could. One evening, as I tucked them into bed, Noah whispered, "Mom, do you think Dad's going to stay this time?" His words hit me harder than I expected. I swallowed the lump in my throat and brushed his hair back gently. "I don't know, sweetheart, but I think he's trying." And for the first time, I allowed myself to believe that maybe, just maybe, he was. Weeks turned into months, and Daniel never missed a day. He was there for soccer practices, school projects, and late-night homework sessions. The boys began to trust him, and slowly, he became a part of their world. But as much as they forgave, I wasn't sure if I could. Every time I saw him with them, I wondered, was this just temporary? Would he disappear again? One evening, after the boys had fallen asleep, Daniel and I sat in the living room, the weight of unspoken words hanging between us. He looked at me carefully, as if searching for something. "I know you still don't trust me," he said softly, "and I don't blame you." I sighed, leaning back against the couch. "It's not just about trust, Daniel. You don't get to come back and pretend like the past never happened. I raised them alone. I went through every struggle, every sleepless night, every moment of fear. And you just left." My voice wavered, but I refused to let the tears fall. "You don't understand what that did to me." His jaw tightened, guilt flickering in his eyes. "I do," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "and I will regret it for the rest of my life." He took a deep breath. "I don't expect you to forgive me, but I love them, Sophia, and I want to be here for them, for as long as they'll let me." I studied him, searching for any sign of doubt, any trace of the man who once ran away. But all I saw was sincerity, and that terrified me, because a part of me had been holding on to anger for so long. It felt safer than letting go. Finally, I spoke. "You can be their father, but don't expect me to love you again." Daniel's face fell for a moment, but then he nodded, accepting my words without argument. "That's enough," he said quietly. "For now, that's enough." And as I watched him sit beside our sleeping sons, I realized that, for the first time in 10 years, I wasn't afraid of the past anymore. Thank you for listening to my story. If you've been through something similar, share your experience in the comments. Let's support each other. And if you haven't already, don't forget to like and subscribe.